Okay, welcome everyone to this webinar on E3's Southwest Resource Adequacy Study 2025. My name is Nick Schlag. I am a partner here with E3 and your MC for today. Before we jump into today's presentation, I just have a couple quick nuts and bolts logistics items to sort through. One is that we are expecting a pretty significant number of participants on today's webinar. So we are going to keep participants on mute throughout the webinar, but we will be accepting questions in the WebEx question and answer feature, and we will be doing our best to attempt those to address those as we go along. I will admit upfront we don't expect to get to all the questions, but we will do our best to answer the most pressing ones that we see. Second thing is that we do have a final report for this work. It is forthcoming. It has not yet been published, but we're expecting that it will be published within the next several weeks. And so you all can keep an eye on your inbox for notification for when that final report that accompanies this presentation is released. So with those housekeeping items out of the way, let's go ahead and jump in. And Adrian, you can jump to the next slide. Wanted to run through very quickly what today's agenda looks like. We've got really 5 topics that we'll be covering in today's webinar. In just a minute, I'm going to hand it over to Ron Clowder, who's a Senior Manager of Resource Analysis and Planning at Salt River Project, to give a few introductory remarks regarding this study. Ron and his team are one of the co-funders behind this work, and so I wanted to give him a chance to say a few things about how the utilities that are funding this work see its importance. After Ron's remarks, we will talk through briefly the motivation and key findings that we've come to through our work. Then I'll be passing it over to my colleague, Adrian Au, who's an associate director here at E3, to take you through some detailed highlights of both our near-term resource adequacy assessment and our long-term assessment, which are really 2 separate phases of analysis that we've conducted for this purpose. And then after that, we'll bring it home with some discussion of broader study implications, and I'll talk through some of the broader implications of this work. So with that, Ron, I'd like to invite you to come off mute for a minute and just say a few words about this study.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I was grateful for the opportunity to just share the perspective on why we supported this study. It was commissioned by the major utilities in the Desert Southwest region, and really it was funded in an acknowledgement that we manage a shared grid, and that reliability of the grid is a shared responsibility across our interconnected systems. And so the utilities that coordinated on this study included Arizona Public Service Company, Arizona Electric Power Cooperative, El Paso Electric Company, Public Service Company New Mexico, SRP, and Tucson Electric Power Company. And these utilities are facing load growth at a pace that continues to accelerate year over year. And it's especially true for utilities based in Arizona, where we're seeing a lot of large industrial customers eager to site new operations. And just looking at this load growth alone would be transformative. As you're going to see today, the grid requires tens of gigawatts of new generation and transmission in the Desert Southwest to maintain reliability, and that's only over the next decade. At the same time, the utilities in the Desert Southwest are increasingly adding renewable resources like wind and solar, and energy-limited resources like batteries to help meet load growth while we're working to improve sustainability. And these sources that we're adding add value to the grid, but they need to be complemented and firmed by dispatchable resources that support grid reliability 24/7, 365. That's what our customers are looking for, and that's why we see so much interest in siting in the DSW. And as you'll hear from E3 today, there's a lot of careful work that each utility does to plan for a reliable and balanced system. And that's especially true with so many new resources having to be built over the next decade and beyond. And this grid that we're working to build, this grid of the future, is going to operate quite differently than the one we have today, the one we're all benefiting from as we sit here. It's going to look more like an even more carefully orchestrated system. It's going to be made of diverse portfolio of resources, and each resource plays a key role in different times of the day and different times of the year. So in addition to the complex plans that each utility needs to develop to meet our needs, we're also having to work through implementation of these plans, actually bringing transmission and generation online that's needed to meet growth And this is a growing challenge. Just in the last few years alone, utilities in the US and across the desert Southwest faced similar challenges across the board when we work to bring on new resources. And some of these challenges include changes in tariffs and tax credits back and forth over the last few years, creating bottlenecks, price changes. Ultimately, what this means is delaying resources coming online and increasing costs. There's limitations on the existing fuel supplies that really limit our ability to add new firm dispatchable capacity. It's really necessary to maintain reliability. And then lastly, as we're implementing these plans, local, state, and federal permitting environments are not exactly aligned. And so each jurisdiction has an ability to delay or maybe even inadvertently prevent resources from coming online. So not only do we need these strong plans, but we need to implement them in a way that meets these reliability targets. And that'll continue to be a challenge over the next 10 years. But the work that E3 will present today represents multiple years of collaboration between the Desert Southwest Utilities, E3, and the Technical Working Group to make sure that we're all on a path to reliable while we're working to improve sustainability. So the results you're going to hear from the near-term assessment are really important because they affirm those resources we need over the next 10 years. And those resources need to be in development now. If they're not, they're likely already behind for meeting our development targets. And the long-term assessment really helps us understand the range of resources needed to maintain reliability at different levels of decarbonization by 2050. And that's going to be really important to help align long-term and short-term plans and help each utility consider the investments that will help enable those longer-term goals. So really, we have an understanding of the near term and the long term that comes from this study, and we know what we need to do, but we don't know exactly what the future holds. So I think what you're going to hear most from Nick and Adrian today is really a recipe for success during a time of really transformational change on the grid. And so for those reasons, we work to have this study complete, and I really appreciate everybody joining today just to learn kind of the critical challenges that we face as we work to implement and build the grid of the future. So thanks, Nick. Thanks, Adrian.
Thank you, Ron, for your comments. And with that, we will go ahead and jump in. I believe we have a couple just other basic introductory slides. Just very briefly, if you're not familiar with E3, we are a 140-person electricity consulting shop with offices throughout North America. We work with utilities, developers, and regulators and others in the industry on the most pressing questions facing the electricity industry today. One of those domains is resource adequacy, and it's an area where we, I think, over the past decade have really been an industry leader in the most advanced analytics being brought to bear on resource adequacy related questions, as well as a thought leader in terms of best practices in terms of how those should be applied. At the bottom here, I have a selection of recent studies that we've published in this area. What I will alert your attention to, if you're not already aware of it, is our most recent study in the Pacific Northwest, which is kind of a complementary effort to this one to look at pressing resource adequacy concerns within the Pacific Northwest region of the West. Next slide. Ron did half of my job for me here in terms of acknowledging our funders. So I wanted to say thanks at the outset to the 6 utilities that got together to fund this group. That is, again, APS, Arizona Electric Power Cooperative, EPE, PNM, SRP, and TEP. I acknowledge them and thank them for their funding. It's also useful for the second purpose of helping to define our study scope. Really, our definition of the Southwest region encompasses the balancing authorities that each of these groups operate, and it really focuses on the states of Arizona and New Mexico. That's what we mean when we say Southwest. I did also want to acknowledge and thank the members of our technical advisory group, who you see listed here on the right-hand side. We brought this group together at several points throughout the study to help give input on the study plan, review some of the analytics, and comment on some of the findings that were coming out. These, I think, are some of the brightest minds in this area with respect to resource adequacy, and we've always found that bringing in these external viewpoints really enhances our own work and our ability to draw conclusions from it. So I just wanted to say thank you to all these folks for volunteering their time in support of this study as well. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on motivation and key findings, and we'll try to keep this brief to save as much time for Adrian to go into the details as we can. Let's go ahead. At face value, you know, resource adequacy is kind of a simple topic. It is the question of, do you have enough resources to meet your electricity loads at all times of day, at all times of year? It's a simple idea, but it's a complex question in practice. What we are seeing, and many of Ron's comments acknowledge this, is that the grid is becoming an increasingly complex machine. And that is by virtue of the fact of many of the transitions that are occurring right before us today. Across the country and really across the world, we are seeing a rapidly increasing role of renewable resources like wind and solar that are variable in their output, energy storage resources that can store energy for use at the times when it's most scarce, and other sort of advanced demand side resources that wouldn't have been possible or maybe even conceivable a decade ago. Now, all of these have a part to play, as Ron mentioned, but they all make planning a little bit more complicated as well. And there's no better example of this in the real world than the load shedding events that we observed in California in August 2020, when we actually saw load shedding after the traditional peak period that utilities plan for. It was in the early evening after the sun had gone down. And this really became a rallying cry for this idea that we really need to make sure that our planning is focusing on the critical periods that matter, which may no longer be aligned with the traditional peak period. Just as it's becoming more complex, it's becoming more important. And this is just to acknowledge the fact that electricity is playing a more and more central role in our everyday lives, from heating and cooling our homes, making our businesses run, growing demand for artificial intelligence, data centers, other things that are becoming more and more commonplace, and electrification of vehicles, transport. So all of these end uses rely on a reliable grid. Next slide. So let's rewind ourselves actually 4 or 5 years ago to 2021, 2022, when actually E3 completed its first assessment of resource adequacy in the Southwest region. This previous study was also funded by the same group of utilities. It followed on closely right after several high-profile reliability events that occurred elsewhere in the country, California and Texas. And it was at a time when concerns around resource adequacy were really rising to the forefront of many minds. I think of it as the point in time when resource adequacy became mainstream. It was in this time that the utilities of the Southwest themselves wanted to make sure, have this sort of check. We have these plans. Do they all stack up at a regional level? Will they allow us to maintain reliability over the next decade? We came to 3 really significant, I think, findings from this work, which I wanted to remind folks of at the outset because it lays important context for the work we have today. One, and many of these may feel familiar already, one is that load growth and aging retirement of power plants are creating a really significant need for new capacity to ensure reliability. But what we found was that the utilities' resource plans identified sufficient resources to meet those growing needs. Number 2 relates to the types of resources we saw in those plans. We saw that a large share of the region's needs were poised to be met by increasing quantities of solar storage and other what we call non-firm resources, but firm resources remain essential for reliability. I'll define firm because this is going to be a key concept that we come back to. When I talk about a firm resource, what I mean is a resource that can produce on demand for as long as you need it to, regardless of weather conditions, regardless of time of day, what have you. Number 3 was really a focus on this idea that the scale of new resource additions needed over this coming decade was unprecedented in scale for the region. It was a transformation of the grid like we've never seen before in the Southwest. And to paint this picture, we drew the graph on the bottom of this screen to really illustrate the magnitude of that challenge, which contrasts the additions, the year-by-year additions of installed capacity in the utilities plans against what we'd actually seen happen over the prior couple of decades. It's a really stark contrast between the coming decade and the previous ones. It's really a 3 to 4-fold increase in the rate of installed capacity needed to ensure reliability, and this was at the time of the previous study. So this speaks once again just to those implementation challenges that Ron alluded to. Next slide. We are now 4 years into the decade that we'd previously studied, and in that time frame, what we've seen is that utilities have largely been able to add resources at the pace needed to keep up with the expected increase in demand that we saw. But there's a lot that's also changed in that time frame, and our view of the future has now evolved as well. Some of the changes were foreseen, some were unforeseen. But chief among them, maybe the largest change that I would note at the outset here is that we've seen this tremendous acceleration in the expectation for new load growth driven by new large customers, data centers, new industry, technology sector companies, all bringing interest in loads to the Southwest region. So what I show here on the left-hand side is a contrast between the load forecast in our current study, shown in dark blue here, against what we'd previously modeled 4 years ago when we conducted this assessment, just to highlight how significant this increase in load forecast has been on account of that acceleration of large customers. Now that growing load occurs at the same time that other things are changing as well. We've got an evolving generation mix. We've already talked about the fact that a mix that includes higher penetrations of renewables, higher amounts of storage, will kind of in the grid in different ways, have risk to evolve. Ron mentioned the headwinds that we've faced in resource development as an industry. These are really headwinds that have faced the entire country in the sense that permitting challenges, interconnection challenges, supply chain challenges have all posed obstacles to actually getting some of the resources that were planned into the ground and operational. The region is facing fuel constraints. Utilities plans have an expectation of reliance on increasing amounts of natural gas resources to meet a share of the growing needs. But at the same time, the pipeline system that exists within the Southwest region today is largely fully subscribed and does not have a lot of spare capacity on it. And for natural gas resources to provide the value that utilities plan on, they also need to have the fuel behind them. And finally, there's a concern around growing frequency of extreme weather. It seems like every year you read the headlines that this is the hottest year on record. We have longer and longer heat waves. And so this is a dimension to resource adequacy planning that is just important to capture when we're looking for those needle in the haystack extreme events. Next slide. So with all of these as the animating forces behind this study, I wanted to spend a minute talking about the twofold scope of the work that we've taken on in this latest assessment. And I want to try to be as clear as possible that there really are two distinct phases or elements to this scope, a near-term assessment and a long-term assessment, and they differ both in the questions that we're asking and how we go about the analysis. The near-term assessment is focused on the next 10 years, and it does reprise the scope of our previous resource adequacy assessment. It is a detailed look at the utility's own load forecasts and resource plans to evaluate, given those plans, is the region in a position to maintain resource adequacy over the coming decade. So in this near-term assessment, which covers through 2035, the portfolio of resources that we study is an input to the study process. It's provided by the utilities. They've given us their best plans as of the beginning of 2025 to model. And the question, once again, that we're seeking to answer is how well do those plans stack up against the regional needs? For the long-term assessment, we ask a different question. And for this one, we are widening our aperture a little bit, both in time and in scope. We're looking out through 2045. And in this case, we are not modeling just a single portfolio. In fact, the portfolio is not an input to this phase, it's an output. Essentially, what we are doing for the long-term assessment is we are constructing a range of different portfolios representing different resources and different load forecasts. And looking across that entire body of portfolios, there's more than 20 of them, to ask the question, what are the features and characteristics of portfolios that could be capable of meeting longer-term resource adequacy needs? So this isn't an effort to study a single portfolio. We're not seeking to define a preferred path for the region or make any sort of recommendation as to what path would be appropriate for the region. What we're instead doing is taking this body of evidence as a whole and looking to discern trends from it, commonalities among these portfolios, and paint a picture of what resource portfolios could allow the region to maintain reliability. And it's our belief that by doing this, we can provide additional context to utilities, to stakeholders, to regulators, to help, again, connect the short term and the long term, to put in context how some of the decisions being made today will fit into the long-term needs of the grid. Next slide. Okay, so really briefly, and this is my last one before I hand it to Adrian, I wanted to run through our key findings from this work. So this is a preview of what Adrian's going to tell you. We have 3 from our near-term assessment, and these should feel familiar because many of these are, reaffirmations of what we found when we looked at this 5 years ago. Number 1, the need for new resources is urgent. Demand is continuing to grow at a rapid pace, and there are plans still to retire some of the resources within the region. This drives a pressing need, and it's even more pressing than last time we looked at this problem. Number 2, utilities plans continue to demonstrate a path forward for the next decade that would allow the grid to remain resource adequate. When we've once again stacked up all the utilities plans on top of one another and analyze them using loss of load probability modeling, we find that that is a resource adequate system over the course of the next decade. Number 3, we find that over that period, reliability risks are shifting rapidly. We see utilities portfolios include significant amounts of solar, of storage, of wind, and with those increasing penetrations of those types of resources, we see reliability risks migrate outside of the traditional peak period into the net peak period in the evening, and again, even deeper into the overnight periods. This has really important implications for the types of long-term solutions that will be necessary to ensure reliability alongside all of those investments being made in the next decade. Next slide. So let's link that back up now to our long-term assessment. Again, this is where we've looked out 20 years, a longer term over the course of the next couple of decades. And we have 3 additional or complementary key findings here. Number 4, diversity we find is a robust long-term strategy. And when I say diversity, what I mean is that we see across all the portfolios that we've analyzed that new gas resources, new renewables, new storage, and demand-side resources provide a really robust foundation to ensure regional resource adequacy across a wide range of conditions. This finding holds across all of the portfolios that we've analyzed. Number 5, across all those portfolios, we find firm resources are critical to reliability. Again, firm means you can turn it on and it's there for as long as it's needed. And those resources are needed to mitigate risks that come when renewable resources are not available or when storage resources run out of state of charge. Those firm resources are what the grid relies on as a backstop to ensure adequacy. And finally, number 6 is that we see over this period that natural gas remains the primary resource option to meet that firm resource need. Natural gas today is the largest segment of installed capacity in the Southwest region, and it's also really the only scalable option that is commercially available today for new firm resources. So with that, what we see is that in all of our long-term cases, there's a significant amount of natural gas capacity that remains in the portfolio as a backstop for reliability. And that's really there for 2 reasons. One is it's firm, you can turn it on and it can be operated as long as it's needed. But the other reason it's there, and it's there across all portfolios, is that you can also turn it off when you need to, and that it can make room for all of the renewables and the storage resources that may also be available at that same time at lower marginal cost. So it's really those combination of 2 features that make natural gas such a robust solution to meet a portion of the region's firm resource needs. With that, I think I will pass it over to Adrian to talk a little bit more about the near-term and long-term assessments. So Adrian, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Nick, and thanks everyone for being here. Like Nick said, this study is divided into 2 phases. And I'll start with the highlights from phase 1. And before we get into the actual highlights, I wanted to back up a little bit and provide more detailed context of in addition to the principal question, but the other questions we asked in this analysis. And like Nick mentioned, the first thing we're trying to do is understand how the resources come together to meet resource adequacy in the region. So we're going to split that up into a couple places. First question we ask is how much capacity is needed in megawatts to maintain resource adequacy in the Southwest. And resource adequacy and reliability here is measured against a 1-day and 10-year loss load expectation standard. The second question we asked is more on the resource side. How do those resources contribute to meeting that need or that reliability target? And finally, we look at the plans in totality to ask how the utilities individually and as a whole meet the region's resource adequacy needs over the coming decade. To answer these questions, we use a combination of the data from, in this case, the utilities and their plans, and second, a detailed loss of load probability study, where we use a loss of load probability model to understand the region's resource adequacy dynamics as they shift over time. I'll get into those details in subsequent slides, and I'm going to split that back up. But first, I wanted to hit the highlights on the load forecasts and what we used for this study, and also the other load components here too. First, as Nick and Ron has prefaced, the region's demand is growing. And more specifically, in the coming decade, we see almost a 10 gigawatt growth between now and 2035. A large part of that growth is in population growth and economic growth, a continued adoption of electric vehicles, and of course, the large loads that Nick and Ron mentioned. In addition to the demand forecast, part of the goal here in loss of load probability modeling is to capture the variability around normal weather. This projection in the middle here represents a regional coincident peak demand under normal weather, but normal weather year over year doesn't always happen. Sometimes there's more mild summers for the Southwest, or summers that are a little bit more extreme and severe with heat waves. Capturing that variability is key, as Nick mentioned, to finding those events that are rare but impactful. So what we've done in this study is to capture 55 historical weather years, capturing that variability of both mild and severe summers. This, of course, extends to not just the summers, but also the winters and all the other seasons as well. The next portion, the next highlight I wanted to touch on is on the resource side. So here, what we've done, as mentioned, is combine all the utility plans and stack them up together to provide a projection of the resource portfolios across the next decade. The chart here on the right shows the total installed capacity in the Southwest, and it's split into two different snapshot years. On the left most side, we see the 2025 existing resources that's close to today's system. And the three bars to the right of it represent a snapshot in 2035, sliced and diced into three different ways. The left bar of the three bars represents the existing resources less retirements in 2035. The bar to the right of that represents those same resources, but layered on top the resources that are currently under development today that will contribute to meeting system needs in 2035. And then finally, the bar to the right of it is those same resources existing resources and the resources under development, plus all the remaining identified resources across all the utility plans. What's striking about the two pictures between today's system and the system in 2035 is one, where there's identified a near doubling of installed capacity in the coming decade. The second are the types of resources that are being added and subtracted. First, the remaining coal resources in the Southwest will continue to decline and take a step back. There is a small addition but important addition of new natural gas, and there's a huge amount, almost tripling of the total renewable and storage and demand side resource capacity in the next decade. It's important to note that the system is uncertain, and there's been a lot of changes since we started this study in early 2025, and these portfolios won't exactly align with the most recent utility announcements and developments. Going on to the modeling, now that we have a lay of the land of the data, as mentioned, we used a loss of load probability analysis to understand the resource adequacy picture in the Southwest. And in this particular case, we used RECAP. RECAP is E3's maintained and developed resource adequacy model, or loss load probability model that we've maintained since 2011. And the goal of any resource or loss load probability analysis is to understand those system risk dynamics. RECAP uses a time sequential approach and also pairs it with a Monte Carlo approach to simulate thousands of iterations to capture variations in load, weather, wind, and solar, and outage characteristics across the system. RECAP is an hourly model that looks at balancing loads and resources on an hour-to-hour basis, allowing us to understand how resources contribute and dispatch across an hourly basis. The primary results of a loss load probability analysis is useful because it allows us to see what the frequency, the duration, and the magnitude of these unserved energy events look like for individual systems. And it's especially important for planning and has become a gold standard in resource adequacy planning because it allows us not only to understand the system characteristics and describe those system characteristics, but also to define the total need and how much is required, how much capacity is required to meet 0.1 loss load expectation, for example, and how those resources contribute to meeting the need. Now that we've gone through the data and the model, I'm going to move on to the analysis and specifically the key findings that we observe across this near-term analysis phase. And the first finding we found, and as Nick mentioned, is the need for new resources in the Southwest is urgent. With load growth rapidly increasing paired with this anticipated retirements, we see that by the end of the decade, the growing needs of the system will be about 18 gigawatts of total effective capacity. The good news is that across all the utility plans when stacked up together, we find that those plans demonstrate adequacy for the region. And this is a combination of the resources that are currently underdeveloped and also those identified across the plans. Those in totality manage to close this 18 gigawatt gap. And what's important to note is that these resources that are being added is, as we showed, is a diverse mix of new natural gas, new renewables, and new storage resources. And that has implications on how the risk will shift over time, which leads us into our third finding, which is we're finding that over the next decade, the reliability risk will shift rapidly in the Southwest. To illustrate that, we use this chart here on the right, which demonstrates the loss of load risk across the time of day. And here, going left to right, represents hour 1 through 24 observed in our RECAP model. And going down, we see the evolution of that loss of load risk across the different years that we've modeled. In today's system, we see that risk concentrated around that evening net peak period, around hours 18 through 21, or 6 p.m. through 9 p.m. This is largely due to the demand staying high after solar periods and the need to fill in and provide power during those hours. Beyond 2028, we see the storage penetration increasing, and the initial few additions of storage is useful to curbing some of that peak, but it also has another consequence of increasing the number of hours of which the system is at the edge of reliability. And beyond 28 throughout to 2035, we see that elongation of that risk period going from the net peak period all the way to extending overnight periods as well, from 7 p.m. all the way to 7 a.m. This has implications on resource value, and especially as utilities are choosing to add new resources beyond those identified, on how marginal or incremental resources contribute to meeting this reliability risk. With this heat map observed, for example, with the risk mostly pushed out to beyond the solar periods, incremental solar will provide limited reliability value. As the risk period extends over time, what we find is that the short duration storage resources will also provide a limited value unless its duration covers the overnight periods. That leaves the remaining periods needed to be filled by firm resources that can provide power over a sustained period of time. And to illustrate how that changing reliability value develops over the next period, we calculated a set of marginal ELCCs for individual technologies in the near-term assessment. And before I describe the results, I wanted to describe what marginal ELCC is. And marginal ELCC represents the capacity value of adding an incremental amount of any particular technology. And so it's a percent of the maximum output added to the system. So for example, if I added a 100 megawatt resource and it achieves 100% ELCC on the margin, then that resource is considered a perfect resource. It's available to provide power 24/7, 365 across all different weathers and all different weather conditions. The table on the right here separates the marginal ELCCs that we observe across each of the technology types. And we've, to be clear, we've categorized them in firm. Find is that the firm resources hold their value despite the change. The variable resources, although they don't change very much, also contribute less than that of the firm resources due to the fact that it's not available all the time. And in particular, solar has a low value because those risk periods have moved out of the solar periods. Where we see the most changes in the energy limited resources, and here we define that as hydro with its limited energy budgets across months, and because due to the reservoir stored energy in reservoirs, batteries, short duration batteries here, and demand response. What we find is that as those reliability risk periods elongate and shift overnight, their initial value is high, but starts to decline over the next decade. And by 2035, we see that they've declined to about 35 to 40%. It will be increasingly important to continue to monitor the marginal capacity value of these resources, as it has implications of how these resources will continue to contribute to resource adequacy in the region. And with that, I want to move on to the long-term assessment, but I wanted to see if there are any clarifying questions here.
Thanks, Adrian. I've addressed a couple of the simpler ones in writing. I think that one question that I'm seeing pop up a couple of times, or a theme I'm seeing pop up a couple of times, is around the duration of energy storage. So maybe you could comment on the duration of energy storage that we modeled in the phase 1 portfolios, what sort of range we're looking at there, and B, how we think about the value of duration kind of evolving over this time period.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I'll first address by the first question, which is the duration of the storage resources being modeled here range from reflect those that are currently in the utilities plans. So that's either existing or underdeveloped. We adhere to the characteristics that are that have been identified there. So that ranged from anywhere from 2 to about, I think, 5.5 hours. The values that we represented in this table are representative of 4-hour storage. So that's a good question. And then as we think about the values of other durations, I think it's important to understand how these reliability risks, the characterizations of this risk, which is as we move from a system in 2025 through 2035, we're moving from capacity deficiency to both capacity and energy deficiency. But the duration of batteries don't have to, for example, extend all the way from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. to get higher capacity value, but rather it's that mixture of the right capacity and energy needed to meet these reliability risk periods. While that's not exactly a specific duration, but really it's that combination of that changing reliability risk that is important to understand how longer durations could potentially have higher capacity values than the ones that we presented here for 4-hour storage.
Okay, starting to see a flurry of questions come in, so thanks for all those. I think in the interest of time, we should move on to our long-term assessment, and maybe we can have a little bit of time to circle back at the end. One question that did come in earlier, though, that you can perhaps address as we go, Adrian, is just to describe what firm resource alternatives to natural gas we included in our long-term assessment modeling.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Nick. Great. I'll go ahead right now to phase 2 work. And again, similar to phase 1, just backing out to provide a more detailed framing than the principal question. Here, as Nick mentioned, it's a bit broader. We're looking not just at one single point forecast, but rather, in this case, 20 different hypothetical portfolios. And the reason for this is because as we're looking longer out, the range of uncertainty is larger. And so we wanted to capture that range of uncertainty in both our scenario design, our methodology, and our questions. So in addition to the first question that Nick mentioned up top on the features and characteristics of portfolios, we're also trying to understand how those portfolios change across this broad range of features. We're also looking at our final question here, across those portfolios, what role does natural gas and other firm technologies play to maintain resource adequacy? To answer these 3 questions, we deployed, in addition to loss load probability modeling through recap, we also added a long-term capacity expansion model. As Nick said, we're producing these portfolios to explore this range of futures, and similar to how utilities do their planning, portfolio planning, LTC is a common tool that can use to produce portfolios under a set of constraints that reflect the system conditions while considering cost. The 20 portfolios that we considered pulled on 3 key levers. First is on load forecasts, asking whether if the system continues to grow as is or at a slower or a faster rate, how does that change the potential portfolio? On the technology set, we explored 2 sets. One, looking at the commercially available technologies existing today, and then another set that encompasses that plus emerging clean firm technologies. And in those clean firm technologies, we looked at a range of longer duration storage, including 24 and 100 hour, I think range from 12 to 100 hour actually. And we included nuclear SMRs and advanced geothermal as well. For more details on that, again, like Nick said, look forward to our forthcoming report on how exactly we modeled those resources. On the final set of levers, we pulled on the different energy mixes, in particular defining them through the penetration of clean energy. And here we explored a 60% through 95%. In totality, these 20 hypothetical portfolios allows us to answer these 3 questions, and especially trying to pull out the common threads across each of the portfolios. So with that, I'll go into the results of the portfolios that we produce, and I'll start with the range of portfolios we produce for the reference case scenario, or reference load forecast. Under these conditions, we modeled a reference load forecast with the commercially available technologies only, and across the 5 ranges of energy mixes. The chart here on the right represents the total installed capacity in the region, similar to the chart that we showed earlier in the slide. And it represents the total installed capacity in 2045. On the leftmost, it represents the portfolio that meets the system needs in both resource adequacy and the achieved clean. On the right-hand side, the similar portfolio that meets the similar RA needs, but with higher clean energy penetration. Because we're trying to understand the common threads across each of these portfolios, the one one thing that stuck out to us is across all these clean energies portfolios, all these clean energy penetrations we studied, we see that a reliable portfolio in 2045 includes a diverse mix of firm, renewable, and storage resources. And we'll get into why in a little bit later. What's interesting is that this finding holds true not only just for the reference load forecast, but also as we bump up or as the load forecast accelerates and decelerates, that this diverse mixture of resources presents itself across each of the portfolios. And this leads us into the first finding of this phase, which is one, we see that diversity is a robust long-term strategy for the Southwest. The chart here on the right represents the range of capacity additions across 2025 today through the next 2 decades across each of the 20 hypothetical portfolios that we observe. And what we find is that the total scale of capacity additions needed is roughly around 50 to 140 gigawatts, depending on the future. The reason for this diversity is that each of these resource types plays a different role. For example, renewables provides a large volume of energy as an available basis as the grows along with the energy needs of the system. Storage is available to shift some of that energy from periods of surplus to deficits, and in the absence of available renewables and limited storage in the storage fleet, natural gas can be dispatched over a course of sustained periods when needed. To the extent that demand-side resources can play any of these roles, they may play a role in reducing the scale of utility-scale resources, utility-scale additions, if it, of course, aligns with the grid needs. And that can include behind-the-meter generation like rooftop solar or community solar, additional customer programs like energy efficiency or demand response programs, or a combination of all of it through virtual power plants or microgrids. The second finding that we see zooms in on the role of firm resources, which we find that firm resources are critical to meeting reliability needs in the Southwest. This is in part due to the increasing penetration of renewables and storage that we saw in phase 1, where increasing penetration moves the reliability risk periods and therefore also reduces their marginal capacity value to the system. By 2045, we see renewable capacity value dip below 10%, and for short duration storage and equivalent duration storage demand response, we see those capacity values also dip below 20%. The chart here on the right represents the installed capacity of firm resources as a percentage of regional peak. And what we find across all 20 of those portfolios is that there's a minimum need of about 45% of, or a minimum penetration of about 45% of the regional peak. And that includes all load scenarios, including the ones with emerging technology. Zooming in on the firm resources, what we find across all the portfolios is that there still remains a share of natural gas, and natural gas remains the primary option for firm resources in the Southwest. The portfolio, and it's an interesting dynamic where across all the portfolios where we see an installed capacity, the range of installed capacity of natural gas falls within a narrow range between 38% to 54% of the peak demand. But as a share of energy, the natural gas resource plays a different role across the different energy mixes. Under lower, clean energy penetrations, gas represents a higher share of the energy mix, but under higher clean energy penetrations, natural gas is really reserved as a backstop for reliability. And to put a finer point on that, we wanted to show some of the results from our loss load probability modeling, where we show a challenging winter week in this particular case, where there are high loads and limited renewable and storage availability. During this week-long period, we find that going into some of these days, we have consecutive days of low solar and low wind output. Low solar and low wind output results in limited energy for storage to charge, which means that the remaining need must be met by other resources. In this case, it's natural gas and nuclear that's meeting the remaining capacity, remaining energy needs across this week. So I'm going to stop here, and hopefully I've laid out some of the analytical foundation for the key findings, and I'm going to hand it back to Nick to see if he can close us out for the implications. But before then, maybe I can answer a few questions if there are clarifying questions, Nick.
Yeah, I think we're running short on time. I will bring up one question that I think is interesting, which is there's a question around how our ELCC analysis in this region compares to others. And I'll just speak to that one briefly. You know, we've conducted these types of studies in the Northwest and in California and in the Rockies. And what we've seen here in the Southwest region, the picture is actually very similar to what we're seeing in California right now. Both of those regions are summer peaking, they have high quality solar resources, and they're moving quickly towards large amounts of energy storage. And so in both California and in the Southwest, we see this trend of shifting from the summer peak to the summer net peak to the summer overnight periods kind of prevailing. And as that happens, the capacity value of storage, particularly 4-hour or finite duration storage, progressively drops lower and lower. The one place where we've looked in the West that this is really different is the Pacific Northwest, where the reliability risks manifest at different times of year and are driven by fundamentally different conditions, particularly hydro droughts. And so in that world, in a system that is more energy constrained and where those risks materialize in the winter, not just in the summer, you know, the marginal ELCCs of different technologies look much different. Resources that can provide energy or that are firm provide much higher value there, and storage actually provides, I think, much less marginal value because the hydro system itself already has quite a bit of that latent flexibility. So thank you for that question. We are definitely running short on time, and I will attempt to just wrap things up relatively efficiently with just a quick circling of the implications of this work. And I was going to skip past our recap of key findings. I think these are probably fresh enough in folks' mind. Just to highlight that from here, we see the challenges really lying ahead in the implementation of these plans. It's worth recognizing that the results that we've shown today indicate that we think that the tools and the methods and processes that utilities are using today are capable of producing a plan for the region that will ensure regional resource adequacy. And that's really not an accident or a coincidence. All of the utilities that have funded this study are using loss of load probability modeling and either have adopted or are moving quickly towards best practices in terms of how those tools are used in a manner that, again, it's not an accident that these plans are stacking up to provide a regional resource adequate picture. Now, the challenge here is in pace and scale and implementation. From our prior study, we had foreseen a need to add resources at a pace that was roughly triple the historical average. That has increased. We're now seeing a need for between 4,000 and 5,000 megawatts of new installed capacity per year over the course of the next decade to ensure resource adequacy. And so when we said that this was an unprecedented pace 4 or 5 years ago, it's even more so now. What this means is that many of the challenges that we face will lie ahead in the details of implementation, and many of Ron's opening remarks alluded to these factors, but there are many steps that are necessary between writing a plan on paper and getting steel into the ground and it being operational. Many of those steps are influenced or controlled by utilities, but many of them also have other actors at play, regulators, stakeholders, other permitting agencies, other actors as well, market participants. And this transition over the course of the next decade while maintaining a reliability for the grid is going to require careful orchestration of all those changes and coordination among all those actors. So we just have one more slide, which kind of tees up some of the places where we see real world risks materializing that could potentially jeopardize the region's ability to maintain reliability while maintaining this pace of growth. And you can jump ahead, Adrian. And that is just to say, here are all what we see as kind of the real world risk factors that utilities and other stakeholders are going to have to contend with over the course of the next decade. These are things like procurement and supply chain risk. We've seen resource development headwinds lead to lower levels of new resource development, cancellations, increases in the prices of new technologies, all of these in a manner that has just placed an increasing strain on how quickly new resources can be built. Of course, it's necessary that the transmission system must also be built out with the resources in order to deliver the generation capacity from the new resources to load. And another complementary aspect of our energy system is that the pipeline system to deliver natural gas to the power plants has to also be adequate for the just-in-time delivery of that fuel, so that those natural gas plants the utilities are counting on can actually have the fuel that they need to operate during those critical periods. And then across the bottom, just very briefly, we see operations and market integration as a potential area of challenge. Many of the utilities are moving towards more organized market structures, but one of the challenging dynamics that we see materializing here is that the dispatch of energy storage resources is going to require this very careful coordination and orchestration to get the maximum value out of a resource that is fundamentally limited in how much energy it can deliver to the grid. Permitting and approvals, there are many processes, some that might span multiple states, that span different jurisdictions, that will require navigation. So this is a place where coordination and communication and proactivity is going to be necessary. And finally, all of this happens as the load forecast itself, the target itself is a major source of uncertainty. Reliability planning these days feels like a moving target, just as utilities are continuing to update their forecasts. And what this means is that utilities are going to have to be nimble in their ability to adjust plans, to contend with all of these different risk factors, and to work with stakeholders, regulators, and others to make this transition possible. So I think we will call that the end of the presentation. I'm scanning the question list just to see if there are any last ones that we might be able to address in short notice.
I think there's one about how we calculate the LCCs and whether E3 is comparing the capacity expansion results when RA analysis uses different underlying risk metrics. Maybe just a clarification here. We calculated the total reliability need or the PRM, the target PRMs and the ELCCs under a consistent reliability target, which was the 0.1 loss load expectation target. We did not use EUE for this particular analysis. For the capacity expansion results, we ensured that all portfolios met a 0.1 loss load expectation standard, but we did not ensure that they achieved the same EUE or LOLH or LOLP standard.
Thanks, Adrian. So I think that brings us to the top of the hour. I really appreciate everyone who was able to join this. Thank you for your time. Again, we will be following up in the next couple of weeks with a link or a PDF copy of our written report, and we look forward to all of you all having the opportunity to take a deeper look at this work. So thank you everyone for your time.